When I was in medical school, I was taken by the story of Dr. Barry Marshall. He was presented to us as the plucky young Australian physician who was up against the establishment when it came to his theory that bacteria caused stomach ulcers. Everyone was sceptical of the upstart, but on the 12th of June 1984, Dr. Marshall stunned his critics by intentionally consuming a broth containing Helicobacter pylori and becoming ill with gastritis. He then took a course of antibiotics, which resolved his symptoms. Dr. Marshall was hailed as a hero who had discovered the cause of gastritis and gastric ulcers. In 2005, the year I graduated as a doctor, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was jointly awarded to Marshall and J. Robin Warren for their discovery of the bacterium Helicobacter pylori and its role in gastritis and peptic ulcer disease. I didn't really question the story until years later when I woke up to the fraud of germ theory. Let's have a look at why the story does not stack up, how Helicobacter became a scapegoat, and how this chain of events linked up with COVID-19 in 2020. Why be uncharitable to the defenceless small germs? Dr. Ulrich Williams. Gastritis means inflammation of the inside of the stomach, and it is reported that the German physician Georg Ernst Stahl first came up with the term in 1728. Those of us that have been involved in the medical system and its associated fields can testify that gastritis and peptic ulcer disease are big deals. In fact, Wikipedia states that half of all people in the world are affected by gastritis to varying degrees, and the most feared complications of alleged H. pylori gastritis are peptic ulcer disease and stomach cancer. Peptic ulcers are erosions into the stomach lining, or first part of the small intestine, which can result in pain while eating or within a few hours after a meal. If they become deep enough, the ulcer can erode into a blood vessel and cause massive bleeding, or form a complete hole through the stomach to cause peritonitis. Most of us that worked as doctors in large hospitals witnessed at least a few events of serious bleeding or even a death during our residencies. Hence, this is something that has captivated the attention of doctors and patients for centuries. It is such a big one that Wikipedia even features a large entry titled Timeline of Peptic Ulcer Disease and Helicobacter pylori. Perhaps it is telling that the timeline ends in 2005 with the statement, Warren and Marshall are awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their work on H. pylori and peptic ulcer disease. Is it a case of case closed for the germ theorists? The first red flag with the germ hypothesis is out in the open on Wikipedia's gastritis entry, where it states that gastritis caused by H. pylori infection is termed Helicobacter pylori-induced gastritis and listed as a disease in ICD-11. More than 80% of individuals infected with the bacterium are asymptomatic, and it has been postulated that it may play an important role in the natural stomach ecology. This is the kind of inconsistency we have pointed out many times when it comes to germ theory and how the definition of words are manipulated to maintain a scientifically untenable paradigm. We are expected to believe that H. pylori is pathogenic, that is, disease-causing in itself, but it is also part of the natural stomach ecology. You can watch some of my other videos, including Why Pathogens Don't Exist, to see more of the fatal flaws with this entire concept. We are also expected to believe that people are, quote, infected, which implies a diseased state, but they are also asymptomatic, so have no dis-ease. In our latest book, The Final Pandemic, we outlined the suspicious story of Typhoid Mary and how the tale was used to bolster germ theory, as well as introduce the notion of asymptomatic superspreaders. Scientific principles are completely lacking in such accounts, and they cannot be scientific theories because the original hypotheses were falsified. Then, to cover up for this, unfalsifiable hypotheses were introduced to keep the paradigm afloat. Now we get to the foundational 1985 paper published by Barry Marshall and his colleagues in the Medical Journal of Australia, with the ambitious title, Attempt to Fulfill Koch's Postulates for Pyloric Campylobacter. I say ambitious because, as many of you will know, Koch's postulates have never been established for any microbes. You can see my videos on this topic, and I would also suggest looking at the Koch's postulates resources at virology.com for more in-depth reading. Additionally, Christine Massey has been accumulating FOIA responses for many of the major institutions who have admitted that they do not have any studies that both follow the scientific method and demonstrate that bacteria cause disease. The links for all of this material can be found in the show notes. In case you are wondering, the bacterium is referred to as Pyloric Campylobacter in the 1985 paper because the new name of Helicobacter pylori was not introduced until 1989. The paper's introduction is highly misleading, as it states that the requirements for the fulfillment of Koch's first two postulates may be obtained from the recent literature. First postulate: the germ should always be found microscopically in the bodies of animals having the disease, and in that disease only. In this disorder, Pyloric Campylobacter is almost always present, adherent to the gastric mucosa. Well, science is supposed to be precise, and we can see that the authors have substituted always with almost always, which is a sleight of hand. It is impermissible for the authors to arbitrarily insert variables in the form of the word almost. The other problem is, quote, in the bodies of animals having the disease, and in that disease only. That is certainly not the case, because as we already know, they acknowledge that in the majority of occasions the bacteria are found, there is no disease, or the subject has a different disease. With either one of these observations, it means that the first postulate was not fulfilled, and we are under no obligation to continue, as the hypothesis has been falsified. However, as this was said to be such a groundbreaking paper, let's read on for further information. They then state, second postulate: the germ should be obtained from the diseased animal and grown outside the body. Pyloric Campylobacter was first isolated in 1982 from a patient with gastritis. This is not disputed. It is a bacterium that can be isolated and cultured. However, the bacterium can also be obtained from humans without disease, as we've already seen. They go on to describe the process of Barry Marshall self-inoculating with the bacterium. First, he took 600 milligrams of the drug cimetidine to suppress hydrochloric acid in the stomach, which is a questionable maneuver and almost certainly done to enhance the effect of ingested bacteria. 3 hours later, he swallowed a 3-day-old culture of H. pylori, although they did not describe exactly what this consisted of. Following the ingestion, he self-reported symptoms of a stomach upset. A gastroscopy was performed on the 10th day when inflammatory changes in presence of the bacterium was noted in the biopsies. Another gastroscopy was performed on day 14 when no H. pylori could be seen and the stomach lining inflammation was resolved. In other words, everything was returning to normal. At that point, Marshall took the antibiotic tinidazole, 1,000 milligrams per day, for a week and reported that he felt back to normal. It is hard to now believe that this is one of the linchpins of the H. pylori mythology that many of us were taught in our medical training, and the paper features as a purported event of significance on Wikipedia's timeline of peptic ulcer disease. However, the experiment was peppered with pseudo-scientific methodologies. For example, 1. There was only one subject. 2. There was no blinding. The subject Marshall expected something to happen on swallowing the bacteria. On this point, I would recommend reading the new book, Can You Catch a Cold?, where Daniel Reuters outlines experiments in which subjects became unwell on exposure to inactive placebos they believed were infectious. 3. Marshall was biased as he was determined to establish bacteria as the cause of gastritis. A good scientist should take the null hypothesis position and do everything to disprove the hypothesis. 4. There were no control experiments in place where other subjects were given cimetidine and comparable broths to drink and then exposed to gastroscopies and stomach biopsies. A further point was that Dr. Marshall was spontaneously recovering from the episode before antibiotics were started. To explain this, they introduced the unfalsifiable concept of immunity by claiming, in our subject, the host defences eradicated the organism, but in individuals who are unable to clear a pyloric Campylobacter infection, chronic gastritis may develop. Which brings us right back to the original problem for their claim. The experiment was obviously inconclusive before it even started, because Koch's first postulate was never established. H. pylori is found in people with gastritis and those without gastritis. It should also be noted that in 1984, Barry Marshall attempted to infect pigs with H. pylori to demonstrate that it causes peptic ulcers, but the experiment failed. If we follow Wikipedia's timeline, we see that there were actually 0 scientific experiments that showed H. pylori caused gastritis and ulcers. Instead, we simply had different researchers around the world finding the bacterium in stomachs in the 70s and 80s. Moving along the timeline, it was claimed that the Fukuda team at Japan's Hyogo College of Medicine proved that ingestion of H. pylori caused gastritis in rhesus monkeys in a 1992 experiment. Fukuda et al. Reported that to demonstrate that H. pylori is a pathogenic organism producing gastric and duodenal mucosal lesions, Koch's postulates need to be fulfilled, implying that Barry Marshall and co. did not satisfy the postulates 7 years earlier. To be fair, Dr. Marshall's paper was ambiguous as to whether they thought the postulates were satisfied, as was the title, which included the word attempt. Fukuda's team took 4 rhesus monkeys and performed 2 endoscopies on each one to conclude that they did not have gastritis at the start. They suggested that this confirmed that an endoscopy performed at 1-week intervals did not cause ulcers, erosions, or any inflammatory reactions. This is a bit of a stretch, as the lead-in gastroscopies were only a week apart. The monkeys were then knocked out with injected ketamine, and 7 mils of a human-derived H. pylori culture was sprayed into their stomachs via an endoscope. And what resulted from this experiment? None of the monkeys became notably unwell or developed ulcers. Table 1 summarizes the underwhelming results, where only monkey 1 developed any significant inflammatory reaction, with the 3 other monkeys merely developing, quote, slight redness in their stomachs. Once again, it was an unscientific methodology, as there were no controls in place. There should have been a comparable group of monkeys that were exposed to multiple endoscopies, ketamine anesthesia, and a similar broth without H. pylori injection into their stomachs. The investigators should also have been blinded to the status of the monkeys they were examining. Interestingly, the authors did not overtly claim that they had satisfied Koch's postulates, and instead made an equivalent statement in the concluding discussion to the one that they made in the introduction. To demonstrate that H. pylori is a pathogenic organism producing gastric and duodenal mucosal lesions, Koch's postulates need to be fulfilled. Discussion. To demonstrate that H. pylori is a pathogenic organism implicated in the development of gastric mucosal lesions, Koch's postulates have to be fulfilled. A further problem with the hypothesis was demonstrated in Table 2, where in several of the monkeys, the detection of H. pylori could fluctuate between positive and negative from 1 week to the next. This is where the whole thing falls apart again, and the germ theory enthusiasts can be observed to be looking at the world upside down. The reason they cannot readily demonstrate that Helicobacter pylori is pathogenic is for the same reason that no microbe can be shown to be pathogenic. The bacteria are simply responding to the underlying changes in the terrain or the condition of the tissue. For example, in some circumstances, they will proliferate to clean up devitalized tissue. At other times, they will be dormant. The medical establishment has long shunned the pleomorphic reports that came from those in the terrain camp, such as Antoine Béchamp in the 1800s. The then developing medico-pharmaceutical industry instead embraced the fraudulent microbiological claims of Louis Pasteur and launched the subsequent phoney war against microbes. However, the mainstream have acknowledged that H. pylori exhibits pleomorphism and can take a helical rod form with flagella through to a coccoid form, as shown here. Unsurprisingly, they still tend to play down the significance of this phenomenon. Perhaps Fukuda et al. Would not have been so surprised that the bacteria seem to come and go in their monkeys if they appreciated that they are not invasive disease-causing microbes, but ubiquitous members of an ecosystem. It is of note that the now famous Helicobacter triple therapy was developed by the Australian gastroenterologist Thomas Borody in 1984. That is, a year before Barry Marshall published the self-inoculation study.
We developed triple therapy in 1984. The development was quite a complex affair. We went through about 36 different combinations, and of course each one of these combinations had to be used to treat patients to heal their ulcers. And finally the best one was bismuth, tetracycline and flagyl.
Barodi's potent brew of bismuth subsalicylate, along with the antibiotics metronidazole and tetracycline, was given for 14 days and hit the commercial market in 1990 under the name Halodac. These days the recipe has changed, and it is usually something like omeprazole along with 2 antibiotics such as clarithromycin and amoxicillin. Triple therapy is aimed at eradication of the Helicobacter bacteria, but of course it indiscriminately disrupts the gut microbiome like an uncontrolled explosion.
The blaming of lifestyle on causation of various illnesses has been the in thing. And of course we believe that ulcers were caused because we're stressed. But now we're learning that much of what we thought was caused by lifestyle is caused by chronic infections that were not recognised.
I have seen patients reporting they feel better after triple therapy, but keep in mind this may have nothing to do with killing bacteria. You can watch my video, The Truth About Antibiotics, to see how antibiotics can cover up symptoms, some doing so through anti-inflammatory actions. In any case, the germ proponents were, and remain, out of control. They never showed H. pylori to be pathogenic, and even on their own terms, how is the eradication supposed to work? According to them, the patient was, quote, infected by the bacteria in their everyday life. So after the alleged eradication is complete, why would the patient not be colonized again? The whole germ paradigm is nonsensical. There are more microbial cells on and in our body than there are human cells. The fantasy of the allopathic magic bullet taking out one type of microbe was introduced by Paul Ehrlich in 1907. But as we pointed out in the final pandemic, Wikipedia continues to state that it is a scientific concept. Unfortunately, due to medical industry indoctrination, most doctors believe that a course of antibiotics will selectively remove the alleged baddies and leave the body in better shape.
We've been able to penetrate and change the concepts by developing therapies that reverse the infection, which then reverse the inflammation and change the natural history of the diseases.
Helicobacter is now such a villain in the world of allopathic medicine that it has its very own publication bearing its name. In 2020, Helicobacter Journal featured a paper titled Clinical and Economic Impact of Triple Therapy for Helicobacter pylori Eradication on Peptic Ulcer Disease in Australia. The paper started with the claim that the H. pylori story is a celebrated example of Australian achievement in promoting counterintuitive clinical research when Barry Marshall and Robin Warren described an association between the organism and peptic ulcer disease and demonstrated its ability to cause gastritis. Once again, the actual facts are completely perverted, as this was not demonstrated in those studies. Anyway, the authors did a modelling study. How could that go wrong? And concluded that over a period of 25 years in Australia, triple therapy prevented 18,665 deaths and saved $10 billion.
Frankly, it sounds made up.
The aforementioned inventor of triple therapy and multiple drug patent holder, Thomas Barodi, was, unsurprisingly, happy to cite the glowing study on one of his websites. In 2020, Professor Barodi decided to weigh in on COVID-19 and announced he had developed a cure for the fictional new disease using another triple therapy in the form of ivermectin, doxycycline and zinc. Although he said publicly that no one will make money from this, he neglected to mention that his biotech company, Topelia, had filed a patent for the claimed ivermectin wonder cure. This is the same storyline that involves the 2020 publication by Kelly et al. That was run with by pandemic promoters such as Dr. Pierre Corey. You can watch my video, The Ivermectin Games, where I examine the foundational pseudoscience behind it all. Obviously, my view on the whole story of Barry Marshall and H. pylori is now completely different from when I was a medical student. However, I do not sense he was being deceptive, but rather that he was truly convinced that microbes cause disease. as do the vast majority of doctors. The belief is encouraged by the industry with research grants and rewards by Big Pharma and other establishment institutions. Aside from very rare conditions, the vast majority of times people experience stomach and gut issues is due to lifestyle and dietary errors, problems that are now rampant in our world. The cure is to reverse the errors, not ignore them and then cover up the problems with pharmaceuticals. Each case will be different, but often the solution can be found with eating less, weight loss, sufficient exercise, and reducing alcohol and caffeine if they are provocative factors. Sometimes proteins and high-starch foods need to be eaten at separate times, while some people find that eliminating a certain food group is all they need to do. If there is pain with eating, then the body is hinting that a fast may be required. Every drug being swallowed should be viewed as a potential disruptor of normal gastrointestinal function and needs to be eliminated as soon as possible. The mainstream like to claim that Helicobacter is more important than stress when it comes to gastric problems, when in fact Helicobacter only responds to the underlying terrain, and that is certainly influenced by stress. Please check out my other material on healthy living and consider becoming a member of Dr. Sam's community through my website or Substack so you can join us in our twice monthly Q&A sessions. Orthodox medical men have been taught to believe that acute illnesses are diseases, that there are hundreds of different ones, each having a specific causative organism, that nature's glorious redemptive efforts on our behalf are the work of malevolent germs and must be rigorously repressed at all costs. Such colossal stupidity is bad enough, but the stubborn refusal to admit what is readily apparent to the average child of tender years can hardly be too sternly pilloried. Dr. Ulrich Williams, Terrain Therapy. If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com